Hi, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with Tim Harford presenting his new book, The Data Detective, 10 Easy Rules to Make Sense of Statistics. He'll be in conversation with Maria Konnikova. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our expanded digital community during these challenging times. Thank you for joining us tonight in support of authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Every week, we're hosting a slew of virtual events, and our schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our bookshelves from home. After the introduction, I'll drop a link in the chat to purchase a copy of Tim's new book. Your purchases and financial contributions, I'll also share a link to donate, make this virtual event series possible, and now more than ever support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these many months, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we just thank you for your patience and understanding. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for the speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can go to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. Alrighty, Tim Harford is an economist, journalist, and broadcaster, a senior columnist at the Financial Times. He's the author of How to Make the World Add Up, Messy, and the best-selling book, The Undercover Economist. He's the host of the Cautionary Tales podcast, an associate member of Nuffield College, Oxford, and an honorary fellow of the Royal Statistical Society. In 2019, Tim was made an OBE for services to improving economic understanding. He'll be joined in conversation this evening by Maria Konnikova, an author, podcaster, and international poker champion, a distinction she earned while researching her best-selling book, The Biggest Bluff. She's a contributing author at The New Yorker and has been recognized with the Robert P. Vallis Prize in Critical Thinking and the Excellence in Science Journalism Award from the Society of Personality and Social Psychology. In our digital world, data and statistics are everywhere, but that doesn't mean that our data literacy has kept up. We're constantly hearing about fake news, and it seems like folks on both sides of any issue can find numbers to support their cause. We're in sore need of a primer because approached correctly, statistics can point to ways we can live better and work smarter. In the Wall Street Journal, David A. Shaywitz writes, "Data, when used to reveal the value of hospital hygiene or the harm of tobacco smoke, can be a vital force for good. But the very power of statistics, the unreasonable effectiveness of data, as 3 Google scientists put it, has also prompted a backlash, particularly as we become aware of the potential for both honest confusion and deliberate abuse." Mr. Harford, a British economist and journalist, hopes to persuade us not to give up on data, urging us to embrace thoughtful skepticism and avoid easy cynicism. And so now I am pleased to turn things over to tonight's speakers.
There. Wonderful. Great. Thank you so much. It is such a joy and honor to bring your book into the world in the United States. So congratulations on its publication here. And I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled to be able to have this conversation. Tim, you know, I've been a fan of your writing for a while. I think we first met when I reviewed your last book, Messy, for the New York Times, and we had never met. That's why I was able to review your book. But I think that this Messy was amazing, but I really feel like Data Detective just on a new level took one of my pet subjects, which is kind of the importance of statistics, and made it just fun and beautiful. So thank you for that. And everyone listening, please do buy this book. I think that it is absolutely vital for the modern day. So that introduction talks about, you know, not being cynical and the power of statistics, but I was actually overjoyed to see that you open your book with a study of storks and babies and the power of statistics to prove definitively that storks actually bring babies. Because when I was getting my own PhD in psychology, this was one of the first studies that came up in my statistics class, and it made an indelible impression on me. And I'd love for you to talk about it, but also to talk about the book from which the study came and your initial experience with statistics, which came from a book that had a very different title from yours, which was How to Lie with Statistics.
Yes, thank you so much, Maria. It's an absolute delight. So kind of you to join me and to join all of us. And thank you for saying such lovely things about the book. I'm still blushing in a very British way. So yes, so Storks and Babies. Look, I'm actually the oldest of 4 children, and I have 3 younger sisters. And when each of my sisters came into the world, I would look at this squalling little thing, and I would say to my mum, "Where did this come from?" And she said, the stork brings the new babies. That's where your baby sisters come from. Well, it all seems slightly implausible, but as you say, Maria, there is in fact a scientific paper published with the title "Storks Deliver Babies, P equals 0.008." And I don't want to get all technical, but what that means is there's a relationship between storks and babies that is not a coincidence. And you can see this if you get a list of all the countries in Europe, say, and get their population of storks. Such lists are available, and how many babies were born each year. And if you plot them on a graph, you will see there's a very clear correlation. This is what this scientific paper is referring to. Countries with lots of babies have lots of storks. Countries with not many storks have not many babies. So what is going on? And the answer is pretty simple. Think about European countries: Germany, Poland, France. They're big, lots of room for babies, lots of room for storks. The Vatican City, Monaco, Luxembourg, they're all tiny, not a lot of room for babies and not a lot of room for storks. And so the relationship is real, but storks do not, in fact, bring babies. And if you have your own disgusting theories about where babies come from, I don't want to hear them. But this study is real, but the actual example of the storks and babies is much older. And it goes back to this book to which you referred, Maria, that was published in 1954, called How to Lie with Statistics, which was my introduction to statistics. I read it when I was a teenager. I didn't read it in the 1950s. I'm not that old, but I read it when I was a teenager. It's a very popular book. It's been around a long, long time. It's sold a lot of copies. And it's a charming little book by a guy called Daryl Huff. And it's got the storks and the babies example and many similar examples. And if you read this book with the cartoons and the maps and the clever little examples, you will come away wiser about how statistics can be used to mislead. But increasingly, I'm worried that you won't come away wiser, full stop, because you'll come away with the impression that lying with statistics is all anybody ever does. The way Daryl Huff tells the story, it's like a magician's trick. You'd be a fool to ever think that what's happening on stage with a guy in the top hat with a wand, you'd be a fool to think that's ever the truth. It's always a trick. And that's not true. That's not the case. And it's an extremely dangerous point of view. And it turns out, I discovered while researching The Data Detective, that 1954, the year Daryl Huff's book was published, is also the year that 2 British epidemiologists, Austin Bradford Hill and Richard Doll, found some of the first convincing evidence that smoking cigarettes dramatically increases your risk of lung cancer. And without going into all the details, you can't figure that out without statistics. There is no way. So you've got, in the same year, this guy saying it's a trick, don't be fooled, and these 2 statisticians discovering something that's really a matter of life or death. And their discovery and the discovery of other researchers at around the same time of just how dangerous cigarettes are, and that has arguably saved hundreds of millions of lives. And to me, one of the points I'm trying to get across in the book is that statistics are like radar or like a telescope. They're an instrument that show you things you can't see in any other way. And Maria, you'll be familiar with this old story about Galileo, that which is, I think, somewhat exaggerated, that the cardinals who were persecuting him wouldn't look through his telescope because they were afraid of being tricked. And we kind of, from our modern perspective, we laugh at that idea. But I see around me all the time people who won't look at what statistics are showing them for the same reason, because they're afraid of being tricked. And it all came to a very sort of twisted end, the story of Daryl Huff, in the 1960s, when Daryl Huff himself appeared to testify at a Senate hearing on the subject of whether health warnings should be put on packets of cigarettes. And he sat there in front of the senators and he told them that he could use statistics to prove that storks deliver babies. And look, while there's a correlation between cigarettes and cancer, don't take that kind of thing too seriously. And the Senate chair said, are you seriously saying that there's as casual a conversation between cigarettes and cancer as there is between storks and babies? And Daryl Huff said, yeah, they seem to me to be about the same. He was doing what he did best, which was to pour scorn on the statistics, to tell funny, memorable stories, and basically to muddy the waters. And it turns out he was doing that because he'd been paid by the tobacco companies to do that, like a number of statistical commentators. That strategy of muddying the waters, of expressing doubt, of saying it's all very confusing, of saying, well, you can never really trust the numbers. It's very powerful, it's very effective. We see it used all the way from the 1950s through to the modern day. And that, to me, is the real trick. If we convince ourselves that we shouldn't ever believe anything, then we're in trouble. And that's the story of Daryl Huff. And I see The Data Detective in some ways as written as a sort of antidote to his book, brilliant as it is, because ultimately I think it's very cynical and it's very toxic. And we statisticians, we geeks, we need to do better.
And your book is a tool for trying to help us figure out how to do better, right? How to figure out how to actually look at statistics and try to figure out, are we dealing with cigarettes and cancer, or are we dealing with storks and babies? Because for someone who's not trained, I mean, it's easy to listen to someone like Huff and nod your head, especially if you want to nod your head, if he's telling a story that you already want to believe in because you're a smoker and you don't want to quit. And if someone's telling you, ignore the statistics, great, yeah. I'll ignore the statistics.
It made it very powerful that the tobacco lobby realized, and I mean, you've explored this in one of your earlier books, The Confidence Games, a wonderful book about con tricks and con artists. People want to believe certain things, and people who smoke want to believe that cigarettes are safe. And the tobacco industry realized, we don't need to prove that they're safe. We don't need to prove they're safe. We only need to give people some reason to doubt the evidence that they're dangerous. And you can see it, you see it with climate change. You don't need to prove that climate change isn't happening or isn't caused by humans. You just need to give people some reason to doubt. You don't need to prove that Donald Trump is innocent of all crimes. You just need to give his supporters reason to doubt that he's guilty. It's the same pattern over and over again. Doubt is incredibly powerful.
And you talk in your book about a phenomenon that's known as motivated reasoning, and how that can play into interpretation of statistics, but also how statistics can be a very powerful weapon against it. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and some of the characters potentially that you've encountered along the way when you've looked at this phenomenon?
Yeah, well, the first chapter of the book begins with a fellow called Abraham Bradius, who is an art critic. And I thought you'd like this story, Maria, because I know you're very interested in cons. And Abraham Bradius was the world's leading scholar of Johannes Vermeer, the great Dutch interior painter. And when we find him, the beginning of this chapter, it's 1937, and he has just been shown a painting that's been smuggled out of Italy that may be an undiscovered Vermeer masterpiece. And so he unwraps the crate where this painting, this treasure, potential treasure, has been stored, and he observes it's on its original 17th century stretcher, and he sees the distinctive pattern of crackling that indicates, so the cracking on the paint that indicates it's very old. It's hundreds of years old. The paint is hard. That shows it's old. It's got a 17th century vase depicted in the image, although it's a biblical image. So that's sort of that's a weird kind of error, but that's exactly the kind of error that you would expect a 17th century painter to make. Painting a biblical scene, he'd use a 17th century jug. All of these things, Bradius, with his tremendous skill, perceives about this picture, which depicts Christ about to reveal his divinity to the disciples at Emmaus. He sees all these things, and he concludes that this is Vermeer's greatest masterpiece. And the weird thing is, all of those very subtle characteristics he observes in the painting add up in his eyes to more than the simple fact that the painting isn't very good and it doesn't look like anything Vermeer has ever painted. And in fact, he says it's quite different from every other Vermeer, which you would think was a clue. But it's all about Bradius's desire. He's an old man by then. He wants to find one last great Vermeer. He has pet theories about Vermeer and his influences, and the forger, a very nasty character called Han van Meegeren. The forger has painted this painting as a trap. It perfectly ticks all of Bradius's boxes, and he just wants so hard to believe that he's won over.
And obviously Van Meegeren, I've just learned how to pronounce his name. Thank you for that, Tim. Goes on to become one of the most prolific forgers whose Vermeers hang in museums. And this goes back to kind of the original psychological question that I was raising, motivated reasoning. When we want to believe something, we will sometimes ignore things like, this is just a really shoddy painting, because we want to believe it so strongly. And so one of the points that your book makes repeatedly, which I think is a really important one, and so let's try to bring it home one more time, is kind of this dichotomy of personal experience versus what the data tell you and what the statistical analysis can tell you, and how much we want to believe the personal experience, even when we shouldn't.
Absolutely. I mean, the reason that I begin the book about statistics with a story about an art forgery, which has nothing to do with statistics, is the realization that what we believe is so overwhelmingly governed by what we want to believe, by our emotions, our preconceptions, our expectations, our political affiliations. All of these things govern to a great extent what we believe, along with, the facts also matter, but they all come into this pot. I wanted to start with a story about somebody who believed something despite his expertise and despite the fact that he really shouldn't have done. Because if we can't get our own heads straight, if we can't be calm when faced with a statistical claim, a graph, whatever that kind of riles us up and gets us excited and gets us angry, if we can't be calm in those circumstances, we don't really have a chance of thinking straight. So you raise this issue of personal experience versus the statistics. And to me, this is a real challenge because they provide very different perspectives on the world. You might think, as a geek, that I would say, that, well, the statistics are always right. Look at the spreadsheet. There's your truth. You can't trust your own eyes. You can't trust your own judgment because it's skewed, because it's partial, because you only see a small part of the world. And all of that is true. But at the same time, the knowledge that you get from a spreadsheet can be very thin and can miss an enormous amount of detail out. So we can look at graphs of the number of people who've died with COVID and come to a certain understanding. And that understanding can be quite powerful. You can see the spread of the graph, and you can see how are we managing to bend the curve? Are vaccinations having an effect? You can see all of those things looking at the data. But it's not the same experience as an intensive care nurse or a doctor having to treat a room full of patients on ventilators, and to see their fear and to see how some of them pull through and some of them don't. And I don't want to privilege the spreadsheet. I also don't want to privilege the nurse or the doctor's experience. You need all of them. You need to get them all together. So it's like the data is giving you a bird's eye view. You see everything, but you see it from a very long way away. And then you've also got this view up close. So one of the challenges that I pose people in the book is to say, well, you've got to think about both. You've got to go and look at the data, even if it just means, read a good newspaper. You don't have to go through all the spreadsheets yourself, but look at the data, look at the evidence. Also consider your personal experience. Figure out a way to marry the two. Like what am I seeing with both of these points of view? And it's not a straightforward thing to do.
No, even for someone like you who's been trained in this kind of thinking. There's a really interesting example that you bring up from your own experience, which shouldn't be emotional at all. It's your commute, right? And how many people are in a train on the London Tube at any given point in time. I'd love to hear just what goes on in your head as you kind of experience something and then look at statistics that don't seem to back it up. And the reason why I think this is such a smart example is it's not political. It's not emotional. It's something where reason should apply, right? Because we know when we're talking about political stuff, people just get emotional right away and they stop listening.
Yeah.
So this is a great example to try to potentially train us to look at both sides.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it because I was trying to figure it out. Like, so I knew the data because I'm a nerd. I knew the data from Transport for London, which does buses and underground trains and overground trains and so on around London. And I knew that the data said that these buses and trains are not actually that busy. The occupation rates are fairly low. So if I remember rightly, the typical occupancy of a double-decker bus, these are quite big things. You could get 80 people on a double-decker bus, no problem, but the average occupancy is about 11. So that's really, you can all be socially distanced on a bus with only 11 people on the bus. You could be a long way away from each other. And yet I would get on the bus and it would be all crammed in. This is pre-pandemic, obviously. And then I'd get off the bus and I'd go down into the underground and I'd stand on the platform of the tube. And again, I knew that the average occupancy of that train was about 100 people. You can get 800 people, 1,000 people on one of those trains. So again, it should be really thinly occupied. And yet I'm like a sardine, the proverbial sardine, wedged in. And I can't even get on the train for 2 or 3 trains until finally one comes along I can squeeze onto. So what's going on? Are the statistics wrong? Well, I believe the statistics, although I did call up Transport for London and ask how did they produce them and where do they come from? They're very excited because they were going to get new numbers from cell phones. They had Wi-Fi and it was all, anyway, it was not actually relevant, but it's always delightful to have nerds getting excited about numbers. I realized here's the basic puzzle. Imagine, or the resolution to the puzzle. Imagine an underground train that going west is absolutely full, and then going east is empty. And then it goes west and it's full, and it goes east, it's empty, which is actually not a bad approximation of a lot of trains going into busy cities. Okay, so what's the average occupancy of the train? 50%, plenty of room. What is the average commuter experience? Well, every single commuter is on a 100% busy train, an absolutely packed train. Nobody sees the empty train. Why? Because it's empty. There's nobody there to see it. It's like the tree falling in the forest and no one hears it. So when I put all this stuff together, I thought, this is how the statistics can be true and my experience can also be true. Obviously, my experience is true. And then, of course, you start going, is there a better way to collect the statistics? You might want to collect statistics on the experience of the typical commuter rather than how busy the typical train is. In fact, you probably want both because you need to know how busy these trains are for environmental reasons. And it was all just part of this everyday ballet of going through life and going, I want to get some numbers on that and I want to figure out how it fits together. It's curiosity, which is a guiding principle of the book.
Yeah, well, I was going to get to that later, but since you mentioned it now, let's talk about it now. So you have these 10 rules or approaches. Would you call them rules, or would you call them?
Yeah, I'm inconsistent. At one point, I call them 10 commandments. And then by the end of the book, I'm like, they're kind of like habits, you know, might be a good idea to get into. And I'm getting very much more forgiving by the end of the book.
Right. So your 10 commandments / prescriptions / ways of looking at the world.
Pieces of advice. Hard-won
Pieces of advice, yes.
Yeah.
You end, so let's start with, well, not start with, but let's go to the end. You end with curiosity, which I have to say, personally, that was my favorite. And it seemed to me like that was the first one, in the sense of curiosity underlying everything else to make you open to all of these other things. So I would love to hear you talk about kind of how you came to curiosity as a rule for looking at statistics to make sense of the world.
Yes, it's the golden rule, right? So you got your 10, and then you got the one extra one. There's a bonus-free golden rule with every pack of 10 commandments. And yeah, the golden rule is to be curious. And of course, we're often advised to be curious. So what is it that I think is important about curiosity? One thing is, it's a state of mind that gets you away from trying to always win arguments. And I realized that a lot of the faults in the way we think about statistics, and in fact, a lot of the faults in the way we think about a lot of things, is that we treat the facts as weapons. It's like, I can use this and I can convince somebody, I can demonstrate that I was right, I can look smart, I can defeat my opponents, whatever it is. Whereas when instead you're looking at the facts as like, I just want to know about the world. I want to figure out some geeky thing about tube trains or whatever. It's a different attitude, and it helps you to be much smarter when your basic question is, what's going on? I want to understand, rather than how can I defeat somebody with this fact. So that's the basic thing. The second thing about curiosity is it is the sort of the fuel that gets you asking all these other questions, because all of the other rules are basically questions. Like, here are questions you should be asking when you see a number. Well, you need to be curious to ask any of the questions. And the final thing about curiosity is it turns out to be a really remarkable inoculation against politicized thinking. So this fascinating study done by a group at Yale University led by Dan Kahan, that they examine these very politically motivated reasoning styles, where people are just able to come to any conclusion they want about gun control or abortion rights or climate change or any of these. We know all the issues. People can reach any conclusion they want because that's what their tribe, tells them how to think. And being better trained, more education, higher levels of literacy, none of this helps. It doesn't help at all. In fact, it often makes it worse, because like Abraham Bradius, the art critic, you're able to summon extra mental ammunition in this argument. But people who are curious, they're not nearly as polarized. And it seems to be because for most of us, when we see an unwelcome fact that is not convenient for our argument, we devote a lot of attention to rejecting it. We'll forget it. I mean, selective memory is amazing. We'll ignore it. There's these great studies about people you can press this button to reduce static so you can listen to this message. But if the message is unwelcome, people don't bother pressing the button, so it's just static. I mean, people are actively able to screen out facts in all kinds of ways because they find them threatening. But if you're curious, no fact is threatening. All facts are just like, a fact. I like facts. I'm curious. So for all of these reasons, it just seemed to be the cardinal virtue. And that's why it's the golden rule, because it just underpins everything else in the book.
It really does. It really does. And I think you can see your own curiosity peeking throughout the book with all of the different stories and characters taken from all walks of life, right? From art to medicine, and everything in between. And I think that that's one of the things that shows that you practice what you preach. Right? You've come to this from a place of curiosity.
Well, I try. This is the great thing about being a writer, isn't it, Maria? Like, you're
It
just like,
is.
oh, that's interesting. I'll go and write a book about it.
So now's I think a good moment to congratulate you on Cautionary Tales, which has launched its season today, right?
Yes, season 2 launched today. I'm so
And
excited.
launched with Jeffrey Wright as Martin Luther King.
Yes, so Cautionary Tales is a weekly podcast about things going terribly badly wrong for somebody. And in each case, there's a lesson. What do we learn? And so some of the cautionary tales overlap with the book. So, for example, there is a cautionary tale, I think comes in a couple of weeks, about Abraham Bradius and Han van Meegeren and this terrible forgery and this Bradius's terrible mistake. The Martin Luther King episode, and Jeffrey Wright is spellbinding as Martin Luther King. He is incredible. You have to hear his performance. It's remarkable. But that's a cautionary tale about the giving of speeches and the risks we take when we speak in public, and how things can go really well or really badly, and whether we should make stuff up as we go along. And it compares and contrasts Martin Luther King, who was always meticulous in his preparation as a young man, with another speaker called Gerald Ratner, who is very, very famous in the UK, not as famous in the US. But Gerald Ratner is famous as the guy who managed to give a speech which, with a couple of ill-considered jokes, destroyed his multi-million-dollar business. And it took seconds for everything to just go up in smoke after he said the wrong thing. So that's a fun cautionary tale. We've got one coming about, as I say, Van Meegeren and Vermeer and Bradius. And we've got one coming about Florence Nightingale.
Yeah, let's talk about that one.
Yeah, so, and I'm very excited because Florence Nightingale is being played by a distant cousin of hers, an actor you may have heard of called Helena Bonham Carter, who is also incredible. But Florence Nightingale is also in the book because she's a hero of mine.
Would you like to talk a little bit about how she figures into the book? Because she comes in a little bit later on.
Yeah, she comes in later on. So Florence Nightingale, just to give people the very brief biographical details. She's most famous as a nurse. She's a Victorian, upper middle class woman, knows a lot of people. She's got friends in the British cabinet, and she trains as a nurse, which her family, I think, view as basically being akin to sex work. It's completely disgraceful. But she trains as a nurse. And because she's so well connected, she immediately gets assigned to manage all of the nursing in Istanbul, these hospitals which are receiving these injured soldiers coming back from the front in the Crimean War in the 1850s. And it's just a catastrophe. They're dying in enormous numbers. So some months, 50% of the men who arrive in the hospital die that month from infectious diseases. And Nightingale is in the middle of all of this trying to fix it. And she gets very ill herself. Eventually, the war's over. She partly recovers. She comes home and she says, I need to understand what just happened, because that was awful. And we surely we need to understand why so many people died. And they didn't have germ theory. This is pre-Louis Pasteur, pre-Robert Koch. And she assembles all of this data with friends and colleagues. So the great epidemiologist, William Farr. She's really into data. She's the first female member of the Royal Statistical Society. But what really caught my attention was what she then did with the data. She was very deliberate that she had a battle to fight, a public health campaign to win. She had come to the conclusion that, and this is not surprising from a modern perspective, but she'd come to the conclusion that the deaths were caused by poor hygiene in the hospitals. I mean, at one point they pulled a dead horse out of the water supply. That'll do it. The deaths had been stemmed by improving hygiene in the hospitals. She had all the numbers to prove it. And the only problem was no one wanted to listen to what she had to say. because although she was the most famous woman in the British Empire, apart from Queen Victoria, she was a woman in a man's world. And the military were embarrassed by her and the whole Crimean War. The medical establishment was convinced she was wrong. The chief medical officer, this kind of sounds a little bit familiar in these COVID times, but the chief medical officer said, well, these deaths are practically speaking unavoidable. Yeah, sure, people die of cholera, but there's nothing you can do about it. And Nightingale said, no, they are avoidable. We, in fact, avoided them in the second half of the Crimean War. I've got the data to prove it. And she understood, and she was one of the first people to understand, that to really make this case, she needed amazing graphics, beautiful, beautiful data visualizations. And I've seen them in their original form in the libraries of the Royal Statistical Society. These astonishing graphs that she produced. They are very, very clever pieces of visual storytelling. And she won. I mean, she saved countless lives. It's a remarkable, I've talked too long because there's loads of, the story goes off in all kinds of interesting directions, but she basically won a public health, or achieved a public health revolution with a fancy pie chart, which is pretty radical in around about 1860. It's kind of amazing.
That's wonderful. I love that story for many reasons. So before we open it up for viewer questions, and there are already a number of them, so we'll definitely be getting to them in a few minutes. I was wondering if you just had if you were to give kind of a piece of advice to someone who's not a statistician and who doesn't have that background. I mean, I don't have that background. I had to kind of learn as I went and still find myself woefully inadequate. But what would you say is the course of action when you encounter a fact, a statistic, something in the news, something out there in the real world? How would you go about thinking about it, evaluating it? What would be your advice to someone in interpreting it?
Sure. So I mean, I'm not a statistician either. I mean, I am a nerd and proud of it, but I'm an economist, and a lot of economics, a lot of the maths in economics is not statistical. So a lot of this has been picked up through experience and just trying to do this over and over again. And the realization that, by the way, that the very best statisticians like Abraham Radius, they can get this wrong as well. A lot of this is about getting your head straight. So what's my advice? These days, I'm emphasizing what I call the 3 C's. So calm, context, curiosity. So calm is the first thing. Remember Abraham Radius, when he saw this painting, he actually said, when I saw this painting, I had difficulty controlling my emotion. They should have been a clue. That's your problem. So much of what we see, social media, newspaper headlines, TV news, it's designed to produce an emotional reaction. I mean, that's why we pay attention. We feel joy, fear, anger, whatever it is, we feel an emotional reaction. And I mean, in your book, which by the way is an amazing book, it's the best book I read last year, The Biggest Bluff. I'm sure everyone's bought it already, but if you haven't bought it, please buy Maria's book. It's an astonishing book about the roller coaster of you becoming a poker player. But one of the things you emphasize in the book that really sticks with me is this idea that some of the biggest mistakes at the poker table come from people going on tilt, and that's all about, what are the words you use to describe it? It's about letting emotions that are not relevant.
Yeah, it's about letting emotions into the logic of the decision process, and they can be positive emotions or negative emotions. Yeah. But the moment that you let emotions that are not integral, but rather incidental to the decision, into the decision, that's when you're on tilt.
Exactly. So you can go on statistical tilt. You let your emotions govern your conclusions. So the first thing is just be calm. And it's much easier when you're looking at a newspaper headline than when it's 2 o'clock in the morning and there's $50,000 on the line. I mean, it's easy. Just take a deep breath, count to 3, and then go back and look again. And just notice what the emotion is. There's nothing illegitimate about having an emotion, but just notice, and then you're thinking more clearly. So 3 C's, calm is the first one. The second is context. And here, I suppose, is where all the the statistical detail comes. But context is really just saying things like, this number, is it big or small? Like this Joe Biden's 1 trillion dollars. I mean, trillions, that's got to be big, right? But how much is it per person? Is it $500 a person, or is it $5,000 a person, or is it $50,000 a person? So turning it into per person, that'll give you a sense. For example, can I compare this number to another number that I do understand? Is it going up or down? Do I know what the definition is? Like, do I actually know what we are describing? I mean, there are all kinds of examples in the book, from looking at infant mortality to gun deaths, to self-harm, to, I'm sure there are some fun examples as well. But where it turns out that the definitions really matter, and you can do all the calculation you like, but you never understood what people were measuring in the first place. So 3 C's: calm, context, and the final one, curiosity, which we've discussed. Just that attitude of mind that says, I'm approaching this number trying to find out something about the world. It's a window onto the world rather than a weapon in an argument. And if you have those 3 C's in mind, you're already so much smarter than most people in thinking about numbers. And if you don't have time to do that, even then, ask yourself, is this journalist, or is this weird context-free graphic on Facebook, or is this talk show host? Are they obeying the 3 C's? Like, are they helping me be calm? Are they giving me context? And are they approaching things in a curious way? Or are they trying to win an argument? I can delegate that task to somebody else that I trust, but I need to notice whether they're paying attention to the 3 C's or not.
I think that's a wonderful answer and a wonderful segue into the great questions that we've been getting from the audience, one of which actually I think deals with the context part of the 3 C's, and that's the notion of variance and how you think about variance. And as Elliot Holden writes, for example, the average of a data set is most commonly reported, but what happens when the average does little to explain the actual universe of possible outcomes? That's kind of what we were talking about with your tube experience. But how do you think about variance, and how do you think about that in everyday life?
Yes, it's a terrific question. So a rainbow is, of course, on average white, but we need to think about the full spectrum. Yeah, and very often statistics are reported by looking at the average, and that's like trying to see what's in a room by looking through the keyhole. I mean, you'll see something, you might even get really important clues, but unless you get the spread of what's going on, then there's a lot that you don't understand. So, I mean, there's sort of different ways in which thinking about variance can trip us up. So one is simply, you can have a static set of data where you're saying, okay, what's your risk of dying from COVID? And your risk of dying from COVID, if you get COVID, risk is probably somewhere between 0.5% and 1% in a rich country such as the US. Probably started closer to 1% and is getting closer to 0.5% because we're finding some treatments. But that, it really depends if you're 9 years old or if you're 90 years old. And in fact, if you look at the data, the difference in risk between someone who's a teenager and someone who is very elderly, like in their 80s or 90s, it's a factor of 10,000. And so to say on average, the risk is about 1%, there's so much there that you're missing. Another way in which variance can lead us astray is in a time series. So you look at, say a price bouncing up and down on the stock market, and you can measure the variance, and you can say, well, it seems to, it goes up by no more than 3% and goes down by no more than 3% and up by no more than 3%. And that's useful, but of course, you're not seeing the really rare events. You don't see the 1 in a century events because they only happen once in a century. And I remember once having a conversation with Nassim Taleb, the author of The Black Swan, who's very famous for thinking about this and really bringing this to light. And he pointed out that if you look at all of these financial data sets, you can estimate the level of the fat-tailedness, like how common are super extreme events. And you can look at the numbers and you can come up with an estimate, but your estimate will overwhelmingly be governed by one event. You'll have observed one single event, and that really governs your estimate of how likely the next extreme event is. And of course, you might by chance have never seen that extreme event, or there might be some much more extreme event just around the corner. So there's no foolproof way to do it, but you need to always bear it in mind. And a good statistician will have tools to describe variance, and a good journalist who's presenting a data set will also have tools to talk about the spread of different cases.
That's great. And yes, Nassim Taleb is definitely a great person to read about statistics as well. I'm glad you mentioned that. So there are two questions that I think are actually quite related to each other, and they're about information overload and how these days, it seems like there's so much out there. There's so many sources, there's so much information, there's so much data. What do we do? How do we sift through it and figure out what's misinformation, what's real, what's fake news, what's actually signal, what's noise? How do we determine whether it's accurate, whether it's valid, whether the source is good?
Sure. On top of what I've already said, I mean, the 3 C's get you a long way. But on top of what I've already said, I would encourage people to try and slow down, and I'm slightly biased here because I do write for a daily newspaper, but I should say I write only for the FT weekend. So really, I view myself as writing on a weekly basis. Slow down and consume the news a little bit less often. Consume your information less often. Slower information is likely to have more context in it, in all kinds of ways. It'll be less influenced by day-to-day variance, just referring back to the previous question. And there's just more time for journalists to think. So I have a radio program here in the UK where I'm very grateful. We've got a really high reputation for getting the facts right and for setting other TV and radio and newspapers, setting them all straight when they get things wrong. But I think that in a way we're cheating, because one of the reasons we're able to do this is because it's a weekly program. And so somebody says something dumb at 10 past 8 on a Monday morning, and we come in on Wednesday having had 48 hours to think about it and to ask around, and then we go, well, yeah, that wasn't true, and here's what they should have said. That's easy, right? When you've got that extra time. So slowing down is important. In the book, I talk about the idea, it's not my idea, it's a terrific idea, of a 25-year newspaper or a 50-year newspaper, and thinking about how the news, good news and bad news, would be reported. So on a 50-year timescale, for example, we do a much better job of reporting the enormous death toll from cigarettes. We'd do a much better job of reporting the threat of climate change. But we'd also be much more positive about a lot of things. For example, the poverty rate around the world has dramatically declined in the last 50 years. So it gives you a different sort of perspective. I suppose the last thing is, when you're reading a piece of news, slow down at that moment as well. There's a great study by Gordon Pennycook and David Rand, a couple of psychologists, and they basically find that if you're able to even ask people just to think for a moment about whether what they're reading is true, they become dramatically less likely to share all kinds of absurd fake news. It's just the fact that we're so distracted. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook. You see something, 1,000 migrants have been stopped at the border with suicide vests, share. Because it's kind of like, oh yeah, that's the thing. That's like the kind of thing that people like me think should be true. If you go, do you really think 1,000 migrants have got suicide vests at the Mexican border? Like, no, actually that sounds like it can't be true. But you just need to slow down and think for a moment. And in the modern world, the algorithms don't want us to slow down and think. Our phone doesn't want us to slow down and think. We have to do that ourselves.
Slow down, I think, is just such important advice. Those two words can help us lead, I think, much better lives and make much better decisions. I think that's wonderful. I love the new feature that Twitter has. Before you hit retweet, it says, "Do you want to actually read the article if you haven't read it?" And I think that that's great. But yes, I'm sure a lot of people say no, the evidence. Dismiss.
Yes, I'd be really keen to see what difference it makes. I expect it would make some. I mean, these things are all a lot of the damage has been done, and I think a lot of the recovery is going to come from the accumulation of small things that make us a little bit more mindful about the way we use our technology. And I'm trying to get people to be more mindful about numbers too.
I think that's wonderful advice. There's a question that I find intriguing from a writer's perspective, not just from content of your book. And it's, was there anything particularly exciting, interesting that you found while researching that didn't actually make it into the book that you wish could have made it?
So I think yes, although I think I'm going to now confess to being a bad writer, or maybe just a writer with a deadline, because both the story about Abraham Bradius and Han van Meegeren and the story about Florence Nightingale, and they're kind of at opposite ends of the book. Nightingale is towards the end, Bradius and van Meegeren are at the beginning. I've rewritten both of those stories for the Cautionary Tales podcast more recently. And of course, when you're forced to pare things down for a podcast, so a Cautionary Tales episode is about 4,500, 5,000 words long. Those book chapters are about 8,000 words long. So you're looking to get rid of nearly half your words. But at the same time, because Cautionary Tales is about drama and story, I'm scraping around looking for extra dialogue, like these people saying things on the record, scenes I can portray. And so I found that redoing them for the podcast, I now think, wow, I mean, it's a good story, but I think I could have told the story better. I mean, I shouldn't say this now because people just listen to the podcast and they won't buy the book. But some of the personal details about Nightingale in particular, and her life, and just the extraordinary struggles she went through, and how clever she was, and in a way how naughty she was in some of the ways she presented data. That's some of those details are not in the book, and maybe the second edition.
Well, no, this is a great advertisement for both buying the book and listening to the podcast.
I completely
two different
agree.
Perspectives.
Absolutely.
Yes, that's what we're dealing with. So another one of our listeners has a concern about excessive data gathering and kind of the world of big data that we're seeing right now. And I think his particular concern is from both a privacy and a how am I being quote unquote rated standpoint. How can someone tell something about me from the data? That's not me. But I would also ask about kind of the flip side of that and the usefulness of it, and whether, how much we should be sycophantic followers of big data, which I think a lot of people are these days, versus a little bit looking to take a little bit of a step back. How should we deal with this changing environment and the granularity of things that are available?
Yes, I mean, it is extraordinary what some of these companies know about us. I mean, the simplest way to see this is, and you can ask Facebook to send all their data, or Google to send all their data. Certainly in the EU you can. I think you may well be able to do in the US as well. But in the EU, legally, they have to send you everything they have on you. But you don't need to do that. You just pick up your phone. If you've got an Android phone, or actually just something with Google Maps, you just look at Google Maps and you can look at my timeline, and it will show you everywhere you've ever been since you signed up for Google Maps. Everywhere you've ever been, it's all there. You can go to any day in the last 10 years, and Google will show you what you were doing, where you were, speculations about where you might have had coffee, or Google Photos. Just look at a photo. I saw the first time I saw this at Google Photos recommending that I have a look at photos of one of my daughters, who at the time was 10. She's now 16, and I'm like, someone to her, I said, look, and it could track her all the way through from when she was about 6. Could recognize her face as she grew. It's like, oh no, this is still the same person. This is still the same person. You just show me all the photos of her, and then they don't care really. I mean, they don't care about. They're not trying to track me in any serious way. They're just accumulating this enormous amount of data, and they're going to figure out what to do with it. So, I'm concerned. I'm also highly cognizant of the fact that these are incredibly useful services, or certainly I find Google very, very useful. I don't find Facebook terribly useful, but your mileage may vary. And I'm not sure I have anything to add to the privacy subject that hasn't been very well covered by other authors and commentators elsewhere. But I think I do have something to say about the trust that we have in big data. I think we nailed all of this in the 1600s. This remarkable monk called Marin Mersenne put together these networks of scientists and connected them in a way that enabled them to collaborate and share data, and experiments would be performed publicly, and people would replicate each other, and they would check, and if they were curious, they could do it themselves. And that's how science progressed. And at the very same time, often the same people using the same experimental methods were making absolutely no progress at all in alchemy. And the reason is all the alchemists were keeping their information secret. Isaac Newton, who was an alchemist, told, I think it was Hooke, who was another alchemist, maintain high silence. We don't want anybody to know. And that just meant that nobody made any progress. Every time somebody failed to turn lead into gold, no one else knew about any of this. Zero progress. And my feeling is that we're at risk of slipping into those norms with these big data sets and algorithms, and for the same reasons. These companies don't want to share what they're learning because there's gold there. And of course, they're making vastly more progress than the alchemists did, but I still think we could benefit from the Marin Mersenne's norms of transparency and collaboration and openness. And that's particularly the case when a company goes to a government and says, oh, we've got this algorithm, we can tell you who's a terrorist. We can tell you, as we had in the UK, we can tell you what exam grades to give all the children who've missed their exams because of COVID. Don't worry, we've got an algorithm. No, you haven't. I mean, you've got an algorithm, but not one that can do what you say it can do. Or we're going to say who gets bail and who doesn't get bail. And it's not that I think it's impossible for algorithms to do a good job. I think algorithms can potentially do a better job than humans at some of these tasks, maybe. But we need to test them, and we need to subject them to rigorous randomized controlled trials. And we might be surprised at what we discover. My favorite algorithm is one from the 1980s that helped doctors diagnose non-specific lower abdominal pain, which could be anything from a ruptured appendix to pregnancy. And the algorithm was terrible. It was terrible, terrible, terrible. It was incredibly fiddly and gave really bad predictions. But when they ran a randomized controlled trial, it turned out it gave really great results for the patients. And it was because the process of trying to do what this stupid algorithm was telling them to do and gather the information and consider the possibilities, it made the doctors much better doctors. So you can have a terrible algorithm and a good result. You can have a great algorithm and a bad result. It depends how you use them, and they've got to be tested and they've got to be subject to scrutiny.
Well, I think that is a wonderful note to end on. I'm so sorry to everyone whose questions we did not get to, but Tim is in the UK and it's 1 a.m. So I promised that we would end promptly at 8 p.m., which is 1 a.m. I can't believe you did this at this time of night. Thank you so much. And you were so eloquent and charming and witty. I think between midnight and 1, I'm asleep. So this was a wonderful event. Thank you so much. It was just an honor to be able to talk to you about your book. And everyone, please do buy The Data Detective. It's absolutely brilliant.
You're so kind, Maria. I assumed that you're always winning poker tournaments at 2 o'clock in the morning, but maybe not. You've been a wonderful conversation partner and host, and everyone should buy Maria's book, The Biggest Bluff, which is outstanding. Really great. Thank you so much, Maria. And thank you, Claire, and thank you to the Harvard Bookstore for hosting us. I'm very grateful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to both of you for an amazing conversation this evening. And thank you to everyone in the audience who asked such great questions. And thank you to everyone for spending the evening together. You can learn more about and purchase Tim's book and books and Maria's book and books at our website, harvard.com, and the link in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I hope everyone has a great night. Keep reading, wear a mask, and please be well. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care.